There is a strange kind of hunger that quietly shapes modern life. It is not the hunger for food, recognition, or even success. It is a hunger for stimulation. It begins the moment silence appears. A hand reaches for a phone without conscious thought. A browser tab opens before the previous one has served its purpose. A simple task somehow becomes 5 unfinished tasks, competing for attention. Minutes disappear, then hours, leaving behind an uncomfortable feeling that something important was traded away, even if it is difficult to explain exactly what. Most people believe distraction arrives from the outside. They blame technology, busy schedules, demanding workplaces, endless notifications, or the constant flow of information. These certainly play a role, yet they are only part of the story. The deeper truth is that distraction survives because it is continually fed. Like any living system, it grows stronger when supplied with attention, and weaker when deprived of it. Imagine standing in a quiet garden. 2 plants grow side by side. One represents focus, the other represents distraction. Every moment of your day acts like water. Every decision nourishes one of them. If you constantly water distraction with random checking, endless scrolling, fragmented conversations, and unfinished thinking, that plant naturally spreads its roots. Focus does not disappear because it lacks potential. It simply receives less nourishment. This changes everything. The goal is not to fight distraction every second of the day. Constant fighting often creates exhaustion. Instead, the goal is to quietly change what receives your energy. Starve distraction, feed focus. This sounds simple, yet simplicity is often mistaken for ease. Many people assume highly focused individuals possess extraordinary willpower. They imagine disciplined minds that effortlessly ignore temptation. But when you observe them closely, another pattern often emerges. Their attention is protected before it is tested. Their environments reduce unnecessary decisions. Their routines lower friction. Their priorities are defined before interruptions arrive. What appears to be remarkable self-control is frequently the result of thoughtful preparation rather than constant resistance. This distinction matters because it changes where effort is invested. The picture 2 people beginning the same morning. The first wakes without a plan. Messages are checked immediately. News headlines compete with social media. An email reminds them of one obligation. A video suggests another interest. A recommendation leads somewhere unexpected. None of these choices seem significant by themselves, yet attention begins scattering before the day has even found its direction. The second person wakes with a different intention. There is no dramatic ritual, no complicated productivity system. Only one clear decision has already been made. The first hour belongs to meaningful work. Everything else waits. The difference appears almost invisible. Hours later, however, the contrast becomes unmistakable. One mind has been reacting, the other has been creating. This audiobook is not about becoming a machine. It is not about removing rest, eliminating enjoyment, or measuring every minute with relentless precision. Human beings require recovery, curiosity, relationships, and moments of play. Focus is not the absence of flexibility. It is the ability to choose deliberately where attention goes, instead of surrendering it automatically. Attention is one of the few resources that cannot be expanded simply by wanting more of it. Time passes at the same pace for everyone. Energy naturally rises and falls. Motivation fluctuates. Attention, however, determines how these resources are used. It acts like a lens. A scattered lens weakens light. A focused lens concentrates it into remarkable intensity. History repeatedly demonstrates this principle. Great discoveries often emerged from long periods of uninterrupted thinking. Remarkable craftsmanship grew through sustained practice. Meaningful relationships deepened because people were fully present rather than partially available. Innovation, creativity, mastery, and wisdom frequently required the same ingredient: prolonged attention directed towards something that mattered. Yet modern life continuously invites the opposite. The invitation is rarely dramatic. It whispers, "Check this. Respond now. Look here. Don't miss that. Just 1 minute." Each invitation seems harmless in isolation. Collectively, They reshape the architecture of the mind. One interruption may cost only seconds. Recovering deep concentration often takes much longer. Over weeks and months, this repeated fragmentation can gradually influence not only productivity, but also identity. A person may begin describing themselves as someone who cannot focus, when in reality, they have simply practiced distraction thousands of times. This is encouraging news. Skills developed through repetition can often be reshaped through repetition. The brain adapts. Habits evolve. Attention strengthens with use. The same principle that allowed distraction to grow can also allow focus to recover. But recovery begins with honesty, not harsh self-criticism, not guilt, not shame. Honesty. There is a difference. Self-criticism often asks, "What is wrong with me?" Honesty asks, "What patterns am I reinforcing?" One question weakens responsibility, the other strengthens it. Every day contains hundreds of small decisions that appear unrelated, whether to finish reading one article before opening another, whether to complete one conversation before starting the next, whether to tolerate a few moments of boredom instead of instantly escaping it, whether to return attention after it drifts. Individually, these choices seem insignificant. Collectively, they shape a mind. A focused life rarely emerges from one extraordinary breakthrough. It is usually built through ordinary moments repeated with intention. There is another misconception worth examining. People often chase motivation before beginning meaningful work. They wait to feel inspired. They hope clarity will arrive first. They expect confidence to lead action. Yet experience often reveals the reverse. Action tends to generate clarity. Clarity strengthens confidence. Confidence increases motivation. Waiting for perfect readiness can quietly become another form of distraction. Movement, even imperfect movement, frequently teaches lessons that endless preparation cannot. This does not mean rushing carelessly. It means recognizing that thoughtful action creates information unavailable through thinking alone. Focus follows engagement more often than anticipation. The longer attention remains with one meaningful task, the more deeply the mind begins exploring it. Ideas connect. Patterns emerge. Solutions that seemed invisible suddenly appear. This is one reason deep work often feels difficult during the beginning, yet surprisingly rewarding after sustained effort. The mind gradually transitions from resistance into immersion. Many people stop just before reaching this point. Not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack discipline, but because distraction offers immediate novelty, while focus often delays its rewards. The human brain naturally notices immediate rewards. This tendency once served practical purposes. Quick awareness of changing environments increased survival. Today, however, countless digital systems compete to capture that same attention. They offer constant novelty precisely because novelty feels rewarding. Recognizing this tendency is not about blaming technology or avoiding progress. It is about understanding the environment honestly. When something repeatedly captures attention, asking why it does so creates awareness. Awareness creates options. Options create freedom. Freedom is not doing whatever feels easiest in the moment. Freedom is maintaining the ability to choose according to long-term values rather than short-term impulses. That distinction quietly transforms everyday decisions. The person who practices focus is not rejecting pleasure. They are becoming more intentional about timing. Entertainment has its place. Rest has its place. Connection has its place. The challenge begins when every difficult moment is immediately interrupted by stimulation. And discomfort itself is not always an enemy. Sometimes discomfort is simply the doorway through which concentration enters. The first minutes of meaningful work may feel restless. The mind searches for easier alternatives. It suggests checking something quickly, remembering another task, looking up one unrelated fact, responding to one notification. Each suggestion feels reasonable. Together, they dissolve momentum. Learning to remain present during this early resistance is one of the most valuable skills anyone can develop. Not because resistance disappears forever, because familiarity reduces its power. Eventually, the voice of distraction becomes recognizable. It no longer sounds like truth. It sounds like habit, and habits can change. Throughout this journey, one idea will continue returning in different forms because it deserves repetition. Whatever receives consistent attention becomes stronger. This applies to skills, relationships, emotional patterns, thought processes, and focus itself. If distraction has been generously fed for years, rebuilding concentration may require patience. Progress is rarely dramatic in the beginning. It often appears quietly. A few additional minutes of uninterrupted work, one less impulsive interruption, a calmer response to boredom, a stronger ability to return after attention wanders. Small improvements accumulate. Days become weeks, weeks become months. Eventually, something remarkable happens. The person no longer spends every day chasing attention back from countless directions. Attention begins staying where it was intentionally placed. That is not perfection. It is progress. And progress, sustained over time, often produces results that once seemed unreachable. This audiobook is an invitation to begin that transformation, not through force, but through deliberate practice, not by fighting every distraction, but by gradually reducing its nourishment while strengthening what truly deserves your attention. Because the quality of your focus often shapes the quality of your work. The quality of your work often shapes the quality of your opportunities, and the quality of your attention quietly shapes the quality of your life. There is a quiet moment that appears in almost every day. Although many people barely notice it, it lasts only a few seconds. Nothing dramatic happens, no alarm sounds, no major decision announces itself. Yet that moment often determines the direction of the next hour. It arrives when your attention begins to drift. Perhaps you are writing an important report, studying a difficult concept, learning a new skill, building a business, or simply trying to finish a meaningful task. Your mind encounters the first sign of resistance. The work becomes slightly uncomfortable. Progress slows. Your thoughts become less fluid than they were a few minutes earlier. Then a familiar idea appears. I'll just check something quickly. That sentence has interrupted more ambitions than most people realize. Notice how carefully it disguises itself. It rarely announces, "I'm about to steal the next 30 minutes. Instead, it promises something small. One notification, one message, one headline, one short video, one search, one glance. By itself, none of these actions appears significant. The problem is not the individual interruption. The problem is the chain reaction that often follows. Attention rarely returns to exactly where it left off. Instead, it carries traces of everything it encountered along the way. One article reminds you of another topic. One notification creates another obligation. One conversation sparks another thought. Even after returning to the original task, part of the mind remains elsewhere. This is why focus is not simply about looking at one thing. It is about allowing the mind enough uninterrupted time to organize itself around one objective. Imagine trying to fill a bucket with water while someone keeps poking holes in the bottom. You may continue pouring with determination, yet very little accumulates. The issue is not effort. The issue is leakage. Attention behaves much the same way. Many people believe they lack discipline when, in reality, their concentration is leaking in dozens of tiny places they rarely examine. Every unnecessary interruption leaves a small opening. Every unfinished task occupies a little mental space. Every unresolved notification whispers in the background. Individually, they seem harmless. Collectively, they become exhausting. One of the greatest misunderstandings about focus is that it requires constant intensity. People imagine highly productive individuals maintaining perfect concentration from morning until night. Real life rarely works that way. Even the most disciplined minds experience wandering thoughts, changing emotions, and fluctuating energy. The difference is not that they never become distracted. The difference is that they return more quickly. That return is a skill, and like every meaningful skill, it improves through deliberate practice. Think about learning to balance on a bicycle. Success does not come from never leaning. In fact, balance is created through countless tiny corrections. You lean slightly one direction, adjust, lean another direction, adjust again, and continue moving forward. Focus follows a similar rhythm. Attention drifts. You notice. You gently return. Attention drifts again. You notice sooner. You return again. Over time, those returns become faster, calmer, and less emotionally charged. Instead of becoming frustrated every time the mind wanders, you begin treating each return as another repetition, strengthening the habit of concentration. This simple change alters your relationship with distraction. Instead of seeing every interruption as failure, you begin seeing awareness itself as progress. The moment you notice your attention has drifted is not evidence that you lack focus. It is evidence that awareness has returned, that awareness creates choice, and choice creates freedom. There is another pattern worth understanding. Distraction often disguises itself as productivity. Answering emails feels productive. Organizing folders feels productive. Researching another idea feels productive. Watching educational content feels productive. Planning feels productive. Sometimes these activities are genuinely necessary. Sometimes they quietly become sophisticated forms of avoidance. The distinction depends on one question. Is this moving my most important work forward right now? If the answer is no, then even useful activities can become distractions when they replace the work that matters most. Many people spend entire days being busy without moving significantly closer to their long-term goals. Busyness and progress are not the same. Motion and direction are not the same. Noise and effectiveness are not the same. One person may complete 50 small tasks while postponing the one decision that would create meaningful change. Another person may complete only one important task, yet transform the trajectory of an entire project. The difference lies in priorities rather than effort. This requires courage, because important work usually carries uncertainty. Checking messages feels familiar. Starting a difficult chapter of a book demands concentration. Responding to notifications produces immediate completion. Building a valuable skill often requires weeks before visible improvement appears. The mind naturally notices immediate rewards more easily than delayed ones. Understanding this tendency helps remove unnecessary self-judgment. You are not battling a personal flaw. You are learning to guide attention in an environment designed to compete for it. That guidance begins with one surprisingly powerful question. What deserves my best thinking today? Not all tasks deserve equal attention. Some require speed. Others require care. Some can be delegated. Others demand your unique judgment. Learning the difference is one of the quiet advantages of mature focus. When everything feels equally urgent, the mind becomes reactive. When priorities become clear, attention becomes calmer. This does not eliminate pressure. It gives pressure a direction. Imagine entering a library where every book is speaking at the same time. Finding one valuable idea would be nearly impossible. Now imagine every voice becoming silent except one. The information available has not changed. Only the level of competing noise has changed. Your mind operates similarly. Focus is often less about adding something new than removing unnecessary competition. Every time you simplify your environment, reduce avoidable interruptions, or finish one task before beginning another, you are lowering the volume of competing voices inside your attention. Clarity grows in quiet places, not because quiet is magical, because the mind finally has enough space to think deeply. Many people search endlessly for better productivity techniques while overlooking a simpler truth. The quality of your environment quietly shapes the quality of your decisions. A clean workspace does not guarantee concentration. A silent room does not guarantee insight, but both reduce friction. Small reductions in friction create surprisingly large differences over months and years. Consider how rivers shape landscapes. They do not transform mountains through one powerful event. They transform them through steady, continuous movement. Attention develops the same way. One focused hour changes little. Hundreds of focused hours reshape identity. Eventually, people begin describing you as disciplined. What they are really observing is the accumulated effect of thousands of ordinary decisions that rarely attracted attention when they happened. The remarkable life is often built inside unremarkable moments. The conversation you choose not to interrupt, the phone you decide not to reach for, the task you finish before starting another. The 5 extra minutes you remain with difficult work after your mind suggests quitting. None of these moments appears significant on its own. Together, they become the architecture of a focused life. The ability to focus is often described as if it were a fixed personality trait. People casually say, "I'm just not a focused person," or "Some people are naturally disciplined." While individual differences certainly exist, these statements overlook a more hopeful reality. Attention is influenced by repeated experience. What you practice consistently has a powerful effect on what feels natural over time. Think back to the first time you tried learning a new skill, whether it was driving, playing an instrument, speaking another language, or solving complex problems. The beginning probably felt awkward. Your attention had to be directed consciously toward every small detail. Progress seemed slow because your brain was building unfamiliar pathways. Eventually, actions that once demanded enormous effort began to require much less conscious thought. Focus develops in much the same way. At first, protecting your attention can feel unnatural. You notice how frequently your mind reaches for novelty. The silence may feel uncomfortable. A single uninterrupted hour might seem surprisingly long. None of this means you are incapable of deep concentration. It simply reflects the habits your attention has practiced most often. The encouraging part is that habits are not permanent identities. They are repeated behaviors, and repeated behaviors can change. This understanding removes an unnecessary burden from personal growth. Instead of asking whether you are good at focusing, you begin asking a better question. What am I training my attention to do each day? That question shifts responsibility without creating shame. Every notification answered immediately trains one pattern. Every moment of sustained concentration trains another. Every time you finish what you started, even when it becomes difficult, your mind receives evidence that persistence is possible. These small moments rarely feel transformational while they are happening, yet they accumulate quietly, shaping your expectations about yourself. Identity often grows from evidence. When your days repeatedly contain examples of returning to meaningful work, instead of abandoning it at the first sign of discomfort, your self-perception gradually changes. You no longer rely on motivation alone, because experience has shown you that you can continue even when motivation fluctuates. This is an important distinction. Motivation is valuable. Discipline is dependable. Motivation often asks, "Do I feel ready?" Discipline asks, "What deserves my attention right now?" The second question tends to produce steadier progress, because it is connected to values rather than temporary emotions. Of course, this does not mean ignoring your physical or emotional limits. Rest remains essential. Recovery strengthens performance. Sustainable focus depends on respecting the rhythms of energy instead of pretending they do not exist. The goal is not relentless effort. The goal is intentional effort. There is a difference. Imagine an archer preparing to release an arrow. Every movement is deliberate. The stance is steady. The breathing slows. The target remains clear. If the archer constantly turns to examine every sound in the distance, accuracy becomes increasingly difficult, not because of a lack of talent, but because attention is repeatedly redirected. Your work deserves the same kind of steadiness. Whether you are building a career, learning a craft, improving your health, strengthening relationships, or pursuing long-term goals, meaningful progress usually depends less on dramatic bursts of intensity and more on sustained periods of careful attention. Many people underestimate the power of consistency because consistency feels ordinary. It lacks the excitement of sudden breakthroughs. Yet breakthroughs are often the visible result of long periods of invisible preparation. The writer who completes a remarkable book usually began with a single page. The entrepreneur who builds a respected company often started with one customer. The athlete, who performs confidently under pressure, typically developed that confidence through countless ordinary training sessions. Focus gives these ordinary sessions their cumulative power. Without focus, effort becomes scattered. With focus, effort compounds. Compounding is not limited to money or business. Attention compounds as well. Each uninterrupted session strengthens your ability to enter the next one with slightly greater ease. Each completed task reinforces trust in your own follow-through. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, what once felt difficult begins to feel familiar. That is how transformation usually happens, not through one perfect day, through many imperfect days directed toward the same meaningful destination. There is another truth that deserves careful attention. Where distraction is rarely defeated by adding more pressure. Pressure can sometimes produce short-term action, but excessive pressure often narrows thinking, increases anxiety, and encourages avoidance. A calmer approach is frequently more sustainable. Instead of demanding perfection from yourself, practice returning. Instead of expecting flawless concentration, expect moments of wandering, and become skilled at guiding your attention back without frustration. This gentle persistence creates resilience. Resilience is not the absence of setbacks. It is the willingness to continue after them. Every return strengthens that willingness. Eventually, the distance between distraction and renewed focus becomes shorter. Your attention begins finding its way home more quickly, and that quiet ability may become one of the most valuable strengths you develop. There comes a point in every meaningful pursuit when effort alone is no longer enough. You can work harder, stay busier, fill more hours with activity, and still feel as though progress is moving through thick mud. It is a frustrating experience because it creates the illusion that the answer is simply more effort. In many cases, the answer is not more effort. It is better attention. Imagine holding a magnifying glass beneath the sun. If your hand shakes constantly, the light spreads across a wide surface. It produces warmth but very little change. Hold that same lens steady, however, and something remarkable happens. The scattered light gathers into a single point. The energy has not increased. The direction has. Human attention operates in much the same way. A scattered mind may spend 10 hours working and accomplish less than a focused mind that spends 4 deeply engaged hours on what matters most. This is not because one person possesses extraordinary intelligence. It is because concentrated attention allows thinking to become deeper, decisions to become clearer, and execution to become more intentional. The challenge is that the world rarely rewards stillness in the short term. It rewards responsiveness, fast replies, constant updates, visible activity. The danger is subtle. Over time, responsiveness can begin replacing reflection. You become excellent at reacting, while slowly losing the habit of thinking deeply. Yet some of life's most important decisions cannot be rushed. Choosing a direction for your career, repairing a strained relationship, learning a demanding skill, creating something original, developing wisdom through experience. These require more than speed. They require presence. Presence is becoming increasingly valuable because it is increasingly uncommon. To be fully engaged in one conversation without mentally rehearsing the next task, to read a chapter without checking another screen, to listen without planning your response, to work without constantly measuring how much remains. These moments appear ordinary from the outside, yet they cultivate a mind capable of sustained clarity. That clarity becomes a quiet advantage, not because it makes life easier, because it helps you see what scattered attention often misses. You begin noticing patterns instead of isolated events. You recognize which habits genuinely move your life forward and which merely create the appearance of progress. You become more comfortable making thoughtful decisions rather than impulsive ones. Most importantly, you begin trusting your own attention again. That trust cannot be purchased. It cannot be borrowed. It is earned through repeated evidence. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, even a small one, you reinforce that trust. Every time you remain with meaningful work after the initial excitement fades, you strengthen it further. Every time you consciously choose depth over distraction, you cast another vote for the person you are becoming. Notice that this transformation has very little to do with perfection. There will still be days when concentration feels difficult, days when your thoughts seem restless, days when unexpected responsibilities interrupt carefully made plans. Those experiences do not erase progress. They are part of progress. The objective has never been to eliminate every distraction. That would be unrealistic. The objective is to reduce unnecessary distractions while increasing your ability to return deliberately to what matters. That is a skill that can serve every area of life. It can improve the quality of your work because your thinking becomes more complete. It can strengthen relationships because your presence becomes more genuine. It can support learning because your mind remains engaged long enough to connect ideas, rather than merely collecting information. It can even increase peace of mind because constant mental switching often creates invisible fatigue. As this chapter closes, consider one simple image. Picture a fire. If you continually scatter the wood across a large field, countless tiny flames may appear for a moment, but none becomes strong enough to provide lasting warmth. And gather the same wood into one carefully tended fire, and the result is entirely different. The fuel has not changed, only its direction. Your attention is that fuel. Each day you decide where it will burn. Some choices will feed endless sparks that disappear almost as quickly as they arrive. Others will feed a steady fire, capable of producing meaningful work, lasting growth, thoughtful relationships, and a calmer, stronger mind. The decision is rarely made once. It is made again and again, often in moments so small they seem insignificant. Choosing to finish instead of switching. Choosing to think instead of merely reacting. Choosing to remain present instead of chasing constant stimulation. These are quiet decisions. Yet quiet decisions, repeated consistently, often create the loudest results over time. As you continue this journey, remember the principle introduced at the beginning and now strengthened through experience. Whatever you repeatedly feed grows stronger. Whatever you consistently neglect grows weaker. If distraction has been generously nourished, it can gradually lose its influence. If focus has been overlooked, it can gradually regain its strength. Not through force, not through perfection, but through patient, intentional repetition. Because the life you ultimately build will reflect not only what you wanted, but what you consistently gave your attention to. And every moment of genuine attention is an investment in the person you are steadily becoming. There is a hidden cost to distraction that few people measure because it cannot be seen on a calendar or a financial statement. It is measured in unfinished thoughts. Every meaningful idea begins in a fragile state. It is incomplete, uncertain, and easily interrupted. Like a seed beneath the soil, it requires time before its full shape becomes visible. If that process is interrupted repeatedly, the idea rarely reaches its potential. It is abandoned before it has the opportunity to mature. This is one reason deep thinking feels increasingly rare. Many minds are exposed to thousands of ideas every week, but remain with very few long enough to develop genuine understanding. Information is everywhere. Understanding still requires attention. Consider how often people mistake collecting knowledge for developing wisdom. Reading another article feels productive. Saving another video for later creates the impression of preparation. Purchasing another course generates excitement about future growth. Yet knowledge that never receives sustained attention often remains dormant. Real learning begins when information slows down enough to interact with experience. That slowing down requires focus. Imagine standing beside a river after heavy rain. The water moves rapidly, carrying leaves, branches, and debris downstream. It is powerful, but difficult to see through. Now imagine the same river becoming calm. The movement slows, the surface clears. Stones beneath the water become visible. The mind behaves similarly. When attention races continuously from one stimulus to another, thinking becomes shallow. Thoughts remain on the surface because they are constantly replaced before they can settle. When attention becomes calmer, deeper connections begin to emerge naturally. This is not because you suddenly become more intelligent. It is because your existing intelligence finally has enough uninterrupted space to work. One of the greatest myths about productivity is that speed is always an advantage. The speed has its place. Quick decisions can be valuable during emergencies. Fast execution matters when the path is already clear. Immediate responses are sometimes necessary, but thoughtful work follows a different rhythm. Writers revise. Designers iterate. Scientists test assumptions. Craftspeople refine details. Leaders pause before making important decisions. The highest quality work often includes periods that appear slow from the outside. During those periods, something important is happening beneath the surface. Ideas are being connected. Assumptions are being questioned. Patterns are becoming visible. Solutions are taking shape. To someone observing from a distance, it may appear that very little is happening. Internally, however, enormous progress is occurring. This is one reason patience becomes such an important companion to focus. Without patience, every quiet moment feels unproductive. With patience, quiet moments become investments. Many people abandon meaningful work because they confuse the absence of immediate results with the absence of progress. A tree does not become strong on the day it breaks through the soil. Its strength develops long before it becomes visible. The same is often true of skill. The pianist practicing scales, the student reviewing difficult material, the entrepreneur refining a business model, the parent learning better ways to communicate, the individual rebuilding physical health after years of neglect. These efforts may produce little visible change during the beginning. Yet invisible progress is still progress. The challenge is remaining committed long enough for those invisible improvements to accumulate. Focus helps bridge that gap. It allows you to continue investing before the rewards become obvious. There is another reason distraction becomes so appealing. When it provides immediate closure, you answer a message, the notification disappears, you finish a quick task, another item leaves the list. These moments create a satisfying sense of completion. Meaningful work rarely offers the same experience. Writing a book cannot be completed in one afternoon. Building trust cannot be rushed. Learning mastery requires repetition. Creating something valuable often involves uncertainty that lasts far longer than comfort would prefer. The mind naturally seeks completion. Distraction offers frequent, small completions. Purpose often requires fewer, much larger ones. Understanding this difference changes how you interpret your emotions. Feeling impatient during meaningful work does not necessarily mean you are on the wrong path. It may simply reflect the natural tension between immediate satisfaction and long-term fulfillment. The ability to remain with that tension without escaping it unnecessarily is one of the defining characteristics of sustained focus. Notice that this is not about denying enjoyment. It is about choosing the right reward at the right time. A musician practices before performing. An athlete trains before competing. An architect spends months planning before construction begins. Preparation often feels less exciting than the visible result. Yet without preparation, the result rarely reaches its full potential. Your attention deserves the same respect. Before asking it to produce exceptional work, give it conditions that allow exceptional work to happen. That may mean protecting quiet mornings. It may mean finishing one meaningful task before opening 5 smaller ones. It may mean allowing moments of boredom to exist without immediately replacing them with stimulation. Boredom is often misunderstood. Many people experience it as an obstacle. In reality, boredom can become a doorway. When the mind is not constantly entertained, it frequently begins generating its own questions, observations, and ideas. Some of history's most creative insights emerged during walks, quiet reflection, repetitive manual work, or moments when external stimulation was limited. Creativity does not always arrive because more information entered the mind. Sometimes it arrives because enough noise finally left it. That possibility becomes increasingly available when you stop feeding every passing distraction and begin feeding sustained attention instead. The mind, given enough room, has a remarkable capacity to organize itself. It begins noticing what truly matters. It separates urgency from importance. It distinguishes activity from progress. And little by little, it remembers something that constant distraction had almost caused it to forget: how to think deeply. There is a question that quietly separates people who make steady progress from those who remain trapped in cycles of constant activity. The question is not, how can I do more? It is, what deserves the best of my attention? At first, the difference between these questions seems small, yet over the course of months and years, they lead in completely different directions. The first question assumes that success comes primarily from increasing volume, more tasks, more commitments, more information, more movement. The second question assumes that success depends on thoughtful allocation. It recognizes that attention is limited and therefore precious. Every yes given to one activity is, whether intentionally or not, also a no to something else. This realization can feel uncomfortable because it forces clarity. When attention is unlimited in our imagination, we can pretend every opportunity is equally important. Reality asks something different. Reality asks us to choose. Those choices shape the architecture of our lives. Imagine an experienced gardener caring for a flourishing orchard. There are hundreds of branches, countless leaves, and endless opportunities for growth. Yet the gardener understands that healthy growth sometimes requires pruning. Branches that consume energy without contributing to the strength of the tree are carefully removed. From a distance, pruning can appear destructive. In truth, it is an act of preservation. Human attention follows a remarkably similar principle. Every unnecessary commitment, every habitual interruption, every obligation accepted without reflection can quietly draw energy away from the work and relationships that matter most. The solution is not to eliminate responsibility. It is to distinguish between what is merely available and what is genuinely valuable. This distinction often requires courage. Saying yes feels generous. Saying yes feels productive. Saying yes avoids immediate disappointment. Yet too many automatic yeses often create a calendar that reflects other people's priorities more than your own. Protecting focus occasionally requires respectful boundaries. Boundaries are not walls. They are filters. They help determine which demands deserve immediate attention and which can wait. Many people hesitate to create these filters because they worry they will appear unhelpful or inflexible. In reality, thoughtful boundaries often increase reliability. When your attention is not fragmented across countless competing priorities, you become more capable of giving genuine presence to the commitments you choose to make. Quality frequently improves when quantity becomes intentional. There is another habit that quietly weakens focus. It is the habit of beginning without finishing. Modern life encourages constant starting. A new book, a new podcast, a new course, a new project, a new habit. Beginning feels exciting because possibility is unlimited. The future appears filled with potential. Completion feels different. Completion asks for patience after novelty fades. It asks you to continue after the easy enthusiasm of the beginning has passed. It asks you to refine, revise, repeat, and sometimes struggle through periods where visible progress slows. Many worthwhile goals are abandoned during this middle stage. Not because the goal has lost value, because the emotional reward of beginning has disappeared, while the deeper reward of completion has not yet arrived. This middle stage deserves respect. It is where craftsmanship develops. It is where resilience becomes practical instead of theoretical. It is where identity quietly changes. Every completed project teaches something that unfinished intentions cannot. Completion builds confidence rooted in evidence. You begin trusting yourself because you have repeatedly experienced what it feels like to carry meaningful work across the finish line. That trust becomes increasingly valuable. When future challenges arise, Your memory no longer asks, "Can I do difficult things?" Instead, it remembers previous examples of persistence. Past follow-through strengthens present courage. This is one reason small promises matter. If you consistently tell yourself you will read for 20 minutes, exercise 3 times each week, write 1 page each morning, or finish one important task before checking messages, and then you regularly follow through, you are building something larger than the habit itself. You are building credibility with yourself. Self-trust develops much like trust between two people. It grows through repeated consistency. It weakens through repeated inconsistency. Fortunately, every new day offers another opportunity to strengthen it. There will still be interruptions, unexpected responsibilities, moments of fatigue, periods where motivation becomes quiet. The objective is not flawless execution. The objective is returning to what matters without allowing temporary setbacks to become permanent directions. This mindset removes unnecessary drama from personal growth. Missing one focused session does not define you. Returning the next day does. Losing concentration for an afternoon does not erase your progress. Rebuilding it the following morning reinforces it. The journey towards sustained focus is less about avoiding every mistake and more about shortening the distance between distraction and deliberate attention. That distance becomes smaller with practice. At first, it may take hours to recognize that your attention has wandered. Eventually, it may take minutes. Later, only seconds. Those shorter recoveries represent genuine growth. They demonstrate that awareness is becoming stronger, and awareness remains the foundation of intentional living. Without awareness, habits operate automatically. With awareness, habits become choices. The more often you choose deliberately, the more your days begin reflecting your deepest priorities rather than your strongest impulses. Over time, those days accumulate. They become weeks, then months. Eventually, they become the story you tell yourself about who you are, not because of one extraordinary decision, but because of thousands of ordinary ones made with increasing intention. As your ability to focus begins to strengthen, something unexpected often happens. The world around you does not necessarily become quieter. Notifications still appear. New opportunities still emerge. Unexpected problems still arrive without invitation. The external environment may remain just as busy as before. The real change happens internally. The difference is that every stimulus no longer receives equal authority over your attention. Instead of reacting automatically, you begin creating a small but meaningful pause between what happens around you and how you choose to respond. That pause is easy to underestimate. It lasts only a moment. Yet within that moment exists one of the greatest forms of personal freedom available to us. Without the pause, habits make the decision. With the pause, values have an opportunity to speak. Imagine a captain steering a ship across a wide ocean. The captain cannot control the wind. Waves rise without permission. Storms appear with little warning. Changing conditions are simply part of the journey. What the captain can influence is the response. The sails are adjusted. The course is corrected. The destination remains clear, even when conditions are less than ideal. Attention works in a remarkably similar way. You cannot eliminate every interruption. Life is too dynamic for that. Responsibilities change. Family members need support. Colleagues ask questions. Emergencies occasionally require immediate action. Trying to create perfect conditions before doing meaningful work often becomes another form of delay. The wiser approach is learning how to return, again and again, calmly, deliberately, without unnecessary frustration. This ability transforms not only productivity, but also emotional stability. Many people experience distraction as something that happens to them. Over time, you begin experiencing it as something you notice. That difference is profound. When distraction happens to you, it feels overwhelming. When you notice distraction, you regain the ability to choose your next step. Choice weakens impulsiveness. Awareness strengthens intention. This is why mindful observation, simply recognizing where your attention has gone, can become more powerful than harsh self-criticism. Self-criticism consumes energy. Observation redirects it. Instead of saying, "I have failed again," you simply notice, "My attention drifted. Now, I will return." The emotional tone changes completely. Progress becomes sustainable because it is no longer dependent on perfection. It becomes dependent on practice. Practice has another remarkable quality. It quietly reshapes what feels normal. At one point, uninterrupted work for 20 minutes may have seemed difficult. Months later, an hour feels natural. Eventually, deeper periods of concentration become part of your routine rather than exceptional events. The work itself has not become easier. You have become more capable of remaining with it. That capacity influences every meaningful pursuit. A researcher can investigate problems more thoroughly. An artist can stay with a creative challenge long enough to discover original ideas. A teacher can prepare lessons with greater care. A parent can offer fuller attention during important conversations. A student can understand concepts instead of merely memorizing facts. Notice how none of these examples depend on a specific profession. Focus is not a career skill. It is a human skill. It improves almost every area of life because attention shapes experience itself. Where attention goes, interpretation follows. Where interpretation follows, decisions emerge. And repeated decisions gradually become character. Character is often imagined as something fixed, something people either possess or lack. In reality, character is frequently strengthened through repeated choices made when no one else is watching. Choosing to finish what you started. Choosing to remain honest when shortcuts appear attractive. Choosing to continue learning after initial enthusiasm fades. Choosing to give someone your complete attention during a conversation. These moments rarely attract public recognition, yet they quietly shape the kind of person you become. One thoughtful decision may seem insignificant. Thousands of thoughtful decisions create a dependable life. This is why feeding focus extends far beyond completing tasks. It influences the quality of your relationships because people feel heard when your attention is genuine. It influences your health because intentional habits become easier to maintain. It influences your confidence because confidence grows from evidence, not wishful thinking. Most importantly, it influences your sense of direction. A distracted life often feels reactive. A focused life tends to feel purposeful. Purpose does not require knowing every step years in advance. It requires knowing what deserves your attention today. Today's focused effort becomes tomorrow's foundation. Tomorrow's foundation supports opportunities that may not even be visible yet. In this way, focus becomes an investment whose greatest returns often appear gradually, not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily. The remarkable outcomes people admire are frequently built upon thousands of ordinary hours that no one witnessed. Hours spent practicing, thinking, refining, correcting mistakes, beginning again, returning after setbacks, protecting attention even when distraction appeared easier. The visible success receives applause. The invisible attention made it possible. As you move forward, remember this simple principle. Whenever your mind begins searching for the next shortcut, the next quick answer, or the next burst of stimulation, your future is influenced less by what captures your attention occasionally than by what consistently receives it. Every day you are teaching your mind something. You are teaching it to scatter or to settle, to react or to reflect, to chase every signal or to remain anchored in what truly matters. The lesson is repeated through ordinary choices. One conversation, one page, one project, 1 hour, one deliberate return at a time. And perhaps the greatest reward is not simply becoming more productive, it is becoming more present, because presence allows you to experience your work more fully, to appreciate your relationships more deeply, to learn with greater curiosity, to think with greater clarity, and to move through life with a quieter, steadier sense of purpose. When distraction is no longer constantly fed, focus does more than survive. it begins to flourish. And once it flourishes, it becomes one of the most reliable companions you can carry into every challenge, every opportunity, and every season of growth that lies ahead. There is a moment in almost every serious effort when enthusiasm stops being enough. At the beginning, attention feels light and ideas arrive quickly. Motivation creates momentum. Even difficult tasks carry a sense of novelty that makes them easier to approach. In that stage, focus seems almost natural, but then something changes. The work stops rewarding you immediately. Progress slows down. The novelty fades, and what remains is the structure of effort without the emotional boost that once supported it. This is where most people begin to drift. Not because they lack ability, not because they lack potential, but because attention begins searching for easier stimulation elsewhere. This is the point where distraction becomes most persuasive. It does not usually arrive as chaos. It arrives as relief, a short break, a quick check, a moment of rest, a small delay. Each one feels reasonable in isolation. Yet when repeated, these small exits begin to reshape the entire rhythm of your work. Focus does not collapse in one dramatic moment. It dissolves gradually, through repeated permission to leave. Understanding this changes how you approach difficult tasks. Instead of expecting uninterrupted intensity, you begin preparing for interruption resistance. This is a subtle but important distinction. Most people try to eliminate distraction entirely. A more realistic approach is learning to reduce its influence while strengthening your ability to return. Think of attention as something that has momentum. Once it is moving in a clear direction, it tends to stay there. But when it stops frequently, it requires more effort to restart each time. Restarting is often where energy is lost. You sit down to work. You open the task. You begin thinking. Then something interrupts. When you return, you are not resuming the same mental state. You are rebuilding it. That rebuilding carries a hidden cost. It is not just time. It is cognitive friction. The mind needs to reassemble context, re-enter the problem, reconnect ideas, regain orientation. This is why long, uninterrupted stretches of attention often feel disproportionately powerful. They reduce the number of times the mind has to restart, and each avoided restart preserves mental energy for deeper thinking. And a useful way to understand this is to imagine driving a car in a city filled with constant stoplights. Every stop requires braking, waiting, and then accelerating again. Even if the destination is close, repeated stops create fatigue. Now imagine a long, open road. The same destination may take time, but the experience is smoother, more consistent, and often less draining. Attention works similarly. Every interruption is a stoplight. Every return is a restart. Focus improves not only by increasing speed, but by reducing unnecessary stops. This is where environment becomes important, though not in a rigid or controlling sense. It is not about perfection. It is about reducing predictable friction. If your attention is constantly pulled by easily accessible interruptions, your environment is effectively training your mind to fragment itself. If your environment supports continuity, your mind gradually learns to sustain direction for longer periods. Neither condition is permanent. Both are adjustable, but the direction of adjustment matters more than perfection. There is also an emotional layer to this process that is often overlooked. When work becomes difficult, the mind does not only seek distraction because it is stimulated by novelty, it also seeks relief from uncertainty. Unfinished work carries ambiguity. You are not yet sure if the outcome will be successful. You are not yet certain if your effort is sufficient. You are still in the middle of figuring things out. This uncertainty creates subtle tension. Distraction offers an immediate escape from that tension. Even briefly, it replaces uncertainty with clarity. A message is answered. A video is watched. A task is completed. Something, at least, feels resolved. This is why distraction can feel emotionally comforting in the moment. It temporarily reduces cognitive discomfort. But the relief is short-lived. The underlying task remains unfinished. And when you return, the same uncertainty is still waiting. Learning to remain with that uncertainty is one of the quiet foundations of sustained focus. It does not mean forcing yourself through discomfort aggressively. It means recognizing that uncertainty is a natural stage of meaningful work. Every complex task begins unclear. Clarity emerges through continued engagement. The more time you spend avoiding uncertainty, the longer it remains unresolved. The more time you spend working through it, the faster clarity begins to form. This is where patience becomes practical rather than abstract. Patience is not passive waiting. It is continued engagement without premature escape. It is staying present long enough for understanding to develop. Many people underestimate how much clarity depends on time. They assume clarity should arrive before action. But in many cases, clarity is the result of action sustained long enough to generate insight. A writer discovers what they want to say by continuing to write. A problem becomes understandable by continuing to examine it. A decision becomes clearer by continuing to explore its consequences. In each case, attention is not waiting for perfect conditions. It is creating the conditions through persistence. This shifts the meaning of effort. Effort is no longer just about output. It becomes a tool for discovery, and discovery requires continuity. There is a quiet threshold in any meaningful task, where effort begins to transform into understanding. Before that point, you are mostly navigating confusion. After that point, the work starts revealing its own structure. Many people never experience this shift consistently because they interrupt themselves too early. They assume difficulty means something is wrong, when in reality, difficulty often means they are still at the stage where understanding has not fully formed. Attention, when left uninterrupted long enough, begins to organize complexity on its own. At first, ideas feel scattered. You are holding multiple fragments at once without knowing how they connect. This stage is uncomfortable because the mind prefers clarity, and clarity is not yet available. If distraction enters here, it offers a tempting exit. It replaces complexity with simplicity, even if that simplicity is unrelated to your goals. But if you remain with the work, something subtle begins to happen. Your mind starts filtering. It begins grouping related ideas. It discards noise. It highlights patterns that were not visible a few minutes earlier. This is not sudden inspiration. It is sustained attention doing its work. Think of it like walking through fog. At first, visibility is limited. You can only see a short distance ahead. If you stop walking, your perspective remains unchanged. But as you continue moving carefully in one direction, shapes begin to emerge. The fog does not disappear instantly, but your position within it changes enough for clarity to slowly form. This is how understanding develops inside complex work. It is earned through continuity. Not through speed, not through intensity, but through staying engaged long enough for the mind to adapt. One of the most important skills in this process is resisting the urge to prematurely conclude that you are stuck. Feeling stuck is often just a transitional phase between confusion and clarity. If you exit too early, you never reach the stage where clarity would have emerged. This is why many people underestimate their own ability. They judge their capability based on incomplete attempts rather than completed cycles of attention. A partial effort rarely reveals full potential. Only sustained engagement does. There is also a quieter pattern that influences focus over time. It is the relationship between attention and identity. Each time you complete a meaningful period of focused work, you send a signal to yourself about who you are capable of being. Each time you abandon work in favor of distraction, you send a different signal. Neither moment defines you permanently, but repetition shapes perception. Over time, your mind begins forming expectations about your behavior. If you repeatedly return to your work, focus begins to feel more natural. If you repeatedly escape from it, distraction begins to feel more automatic. This is not about judgment. It is about awareness. Because once you see the pattern clearly, you can begin to influence it. Not by forcing yourself into perfection, but by increasing the number of times you return. Return is the key variable, not avoidance, not intensity. Return. Every return reinforces the idea that attention can be directed again, even after it has drifted, and this reduces the emotional weight of distraction. Instead of seeing distraction as failure, you begin seeing it as interruption, followed by correction. That correction is where growth actually happens. Another important element of sustained focus is the ability to tolerate slow progress without losing direction. Modern environments often condition the mind to expect rapid feedback. Small actions produce immediate responses. Messages arrive instantly. Content updates continuously. Progress is often measured in visible signals. Deep work does not follow this rhythm. It develops slowly, sometimes invisibly. At times, it may feel as if nothing is happening at all. This perception can be misleading. Much of the progress is internal before it becomes external. Understanding is forming. Skill is stabilizing. Mental models are strengthening. But none of this always appears immediately in external results. This gap between internal development and external visibility is where many people lose patience. They interpret silence as stagnation. They interpret lack of visible change as lack of progress. But in reality, some of the most important forms of growth are not immediately observable. They accumulate quietly. Then, at a certain point, they become visible all at once. This sudden visibility can create the illusion of a breakthrough, when in fact, it was the result of many quiet sessions of sustained attention. Recognizing this helps stabilize motivation, because you no longer rely on constant visible confirmation. You begin trusting the process of continuity itself, and continuity becomes easier when it is not constantly interrupted by doubt. Doubt, when unchecked, often pushes attention outward, toward new ideas, new systems, new methods, new distractions, disguised as solutions. But focus deepens when attention remains committed long enough to allow results to mature. This does not mean ignoring reflection or refusing adjustment. It means avoiding constant abandonment in search of novelty. Progress often requires staying with one direction long enough to see what it actually produces. Only then can refinement become meaningful. Otherwise, you are always restarting, never refining. And restarting consumes far more energy than improving something already in motion. This is why consistency is often more powerful than intensity. Intensity can create momentum. Consistency maintains it. And sustained focus depends more on maintenance than bursts. The mind becomes more stable when it learns that attention will not be constantly redirected. It begins settling, and in that settling, depth becomes possible. Depth is where real understanding lives, not at the surface of quick engagement, but in the extended engagement that allows ideas to fully unfold. At a certain point, the relationship you have with your own attention begins to matter more than any external system, tool, or method. Tools can assist focus. Environment can support focus. Planning can guide focus. But none of these replace the internal skill of returning your attention to what matters, especially when it has wandered without permission. That skill is quiet, almost invisible, yet it determines the stability of everything else. There is a simple but powerful observation that emerges the more you study sustained effort. Most failures in focus are not dramatic collapses. They are small, repeated transitions away from what matters. A glance away, a quick interruption, a short hesitation, a brief curiosity. Individually, they seem harmless, but they accumulate into fragmentation. And fragmentation is what weakens deep work over time. The opposite of fragmentation is continuity. Continuity is not rigidity. It is the ability to remain with a single direction long enough for meaningful development to occur. This does not mean ignoring life's variety. It means giving important work uninterrupted space when it requires it. One of the most reliable ways to build continuity is to reduce the number of decisions you make in the middle of focused work. Every unnecessary decision introduces a moment of vulnerability. What should I check next? Should I respond now or later? Should I switch tasks? Should I take a break? Each question opens a door. Not all doors lead away from focus, but many do. When you reduce unnecessary decisions, you preserve mental momentum. Momentum is fragile at the beginning, but becomes powerful once established. This is why starting often feels difficult, but continuing becomes easier. The mind resists entry into focused states because it must reorganize itself. But once reorganized, it prefers not to break that structure unnecessarily. You can observe this in your own experience. There are moments when you are deeply engaged in something meaningful, and time feels less noticeable. Thoughts align, actions feel smoother, there is less internal resistance. Then an interruption occurs. And when you return, you do not immediately re-enter the same depth. You must rebuild it. This rebuilding is what makes interruptions costly, even when they are brief. Understanding this leads to a subtle shift in behavior. You begin protecting continuity not through force, but through awareness of cost. Not every interruption is avoidable, but many are optional, and optional interruptions are where focus is most often lost. As this awareness grows, you start making different choices without needing strict rules. You may close unnecessary sources of input during important work. You may delay responses instead of reacting immediately. You may complete one task before opening another. You may allow yourself to experience short periods of boredom without escaping them instantly. None of these actions require intensity. They require intention. And intention, repeated over time, reshapes habit. There is also an important emotional transformation that occurs alongside this process. At first, focused work may feel like restriction. You are limiting options. You are reducing stimulation. You are delaying gratification. But over time, something changes. What once felt like restriction begins to feel like clarity, because attention that is not constantly divided begins to feel lighter, not heavier. The mind becomes less crowded. Thoughts become easier to follow. Decisions become simpler. There is less internal noise competing for awareness. This clarity is often mistaken for external calmness. In reality, it is internal organization. A structured mind does not feel the same as a scattered one. Even in complex situations, it has fewer competing threads running at the same time. That reduction in internal fragmentation creates a subtle but meaningful sense of stability. Not excitement, not intensity, stability. And stability is what allows sustained effort to feel less draining over time. Eventually, focus becomes less about effort and more about familiarity. You are no longer fighting for attention in every moment. You are simply guiding it. Gently, repeatedly, without unnecessary tension. This is where focus begins to feel natural rather than forced. Not because distractions disappear, but because your relationship with them changes. They no longer automatically dictate your direction. They become signals that you can choose to engage with or ignore based on context. This is the essence of disciplined attention, not elimination of distraction, but reduced dependency on it. And as that dependency weakens, something important becomes possible. Longer periods of uninterrupted thinking, deeper understanding of complex problems, more complete execution of meaningful work, and a quieter internal experience of progress. Not rushed, not fragmented, but steady. And over time, that steadiness becomes one of the most reliable foundations for anything you choose to build. Because what you can sustain determines what you can create, and what you can consistently give attention to ultimately shapes the direction of your life more than any single decision ever will. At some point, the problem is no longer that you don't know what matters. It is that you know, but you do not consistently stay with it long enough for it to fully develop. This is where focus shifts from being an idea about productivity into something closer to a form of discipline around continuity. Continuity is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It is not visible in short bursts of observation. It exists in the background of your day, shaping outcomes through sustained presence rather than sudden effort. Most people underestimate this because attention is easily seduced by visible movement. Switching tasks feels like progress. Opening new tabs feels like exploration. Starting something new feels like advancement. But continuity often looks less active from the outside. One task, one direction, one sustained engagement. Nothing flashy. Yet beneath that surface, something important is happening. The mind is stabilizing around a single problem, long enough for deeper layers to reveal themselves. Think about how this works in any complex field. A surgeon does not achieve precision by constantly changing techniques mid-procedure. A musician does not develop mastery by switching instruments every few minutes. A writer does not create clarity by abandoning every paragraph the moment it becomes challenging. Depth requires staying, not because staying is comfortable, but because staying allows something to unfold that cannot appear in short exposure. This is one of the central tensions in focus. The mind prefers novelty. But meaningful outcomes often require repetition. Novelty provides stimulation. Repetition builds structure. Structure is what allows complexity to become manageable. Without structure, even simple tasks feel scattered. With structure, even difficult tasks become navigable. There is a subtle moment that often determines whether focus continues or breaks. It happens after the initial engagement phase. At first, entering a task requires effort. Then, once you are inside it, there is a brief period where things begin to align. Thoughts are forming, direction is emerging, progress is visible. Then, almost imperceptibly, the initial momentum begins to flatten. This is the transition point. It is where many distractions become most attractive, because the mind interprets this flattening as loss of energy, when in reality, it is often the beginning of depth. Early momentum is usually fast and unstable. Deeper engagement is slower but more stable. If you exit at this point, you repeatedly reset yourself at the surface level of effort. If you stay, you move into a different layer entirely. This is where real thinking begins. Not reactive thinking, not surface-level execution, but sustained engagement with complexity long enough for insight to form. One of the most useful internal shifts is learning to interpret resistance differently. Resistance does not always mean something is wrong. Often, it means something important is being engaged. The mind resists when it is entering unfamiliar structure. It resists when clarity has not yet formed. It resists when immediate reward is absent. If you interpret resistance as a stop signal, you exit prematurely. If you interpret it as a transition signal, you remain long enough for the system to reorganize itself. This interpretation changes behavior without forcing it. You are no longer reacting to discomfort as a warning to escape. You are recognizing it as part of the process of building understanding. Another important aspect of continuity is reducing the mental cost of re-entry. Every time you leave a task and return later, you must rebuild context. What was I thinking? Where was I going with this? What was the next step? Even small interruptions create this micro-reconstruction. It is subtle, but it accumulates. Over time, it creates the feeling of constant mental fatigue even when actual workload is not extreme. Focus improves significantly when re-entry costs are minimized. This does not require perfection. It requires awareness of fragmentation. The fewer times you exit and re-enter, the more energy remains available for actual thinking instead of reconstruction. This is why long, uninterrupted stretches of attention often feel disproportionately productive. Not because they are more intense, but because they reduce the hidden overhead of restarting. There is also a deeper psychological shift that begins to emerge when continuity becomes more stable. Your relationship with unfinished work changes. Instead of seeing unfinished work as a source of pressure, you begin seeing it as a natural stage of progression. Work is no longer judged only by completion. It is understood as a sequence of development. This reduces internal urgency that often drives unnecessary switching. When everything feels urgent, nothing receives stable attention. When urgency is placed in perspective, attention can remain anchored. This anchoring is not rigidity. It is direction. And direction is what allows effort to compound over time. Without direction, effort disperses. With direction, effort accumulates. Accumulation is what creates visible change. Not intensity alone, not occasional breakthroughs, but repeated engagement with the same direction long enough for results to compound. This is the quiet foundation of focus, not elimination of distraction in every moment, but a gradual strengthening of continuity until staying becomes easier than leaving. And once that shift begins to stabilize, the mind starts experiencing something new. Not constant stimulation, not constant novelty, but a deeper form of clarity that emerges only when attention is allowed to remain in one place long enough to understand what is actually there. At a certain level of attention, the real challenge is no longer understanding what to do. It is staying with what you already know you should be doing long enough for it to matter. This is where focus becomes less about discovery and more about resistance to unnecessary change. The mind has a strong tendency to reinterpret discomfort as a signal to switch direction. A task becomes difficult, and immediately another option appears more attractive. A problem feels unclear, and suddenly a different task feels more manageable. Energy drops slightly, and the mind begins negotiating for a new activity that feels easier in the moment. None of this is unusual. It is how attention naturally protects itself from sustained strain. But protection and progress are not always aligned. What feels easier is not always what is more valuable. What feels comfortable is not always what leads to clarity. This is where discipline becomes relevant, not as force, but as stabilization. Stabilization means reducing unnecessary shifts in direction once a meaningful task has already been chosen. It does not require emotional intensity. It requires consistency in response. When the mind suggests switching, you do not need to argue with it. You simply recognize the suggestion and remain with the current direction. Over time, this builds a kind of internal reliability. Not perfection, reliability. A predictable return to what matters, even when attention attempts to scatter. There is a subtle but important distinction between forcing focus and maintaining focus. Forcing creates tension. Maintaining creates structure. Forcing relies on constant effort. Maintaining relies on fewer decisions during the process itself. When too many decisions exist inside the execution phase, attention fragments naturally. The mind is repeatedly asked to evaluate alternatives instead of continuing the same line of thought. This is why long periods of uninterrupted work often feel smoother than repeated short sessions. Each return to work requires re-entry. Each re-entry requires reconstruction, and each reconstruction consumes cognitive energy that could otherwise be used for deeper thinking. When you reduce these transitions, the mind begins to settle into a more stable operating rhythm. That stability is what allows depth to emerge. Depth is not produced instantly. It develops gradually, as attention remains in one conceptual space long enough for patterns to become visible. Early engagement is often descriptive. You are identifying elements, mapping structure, and orienting yourself within the task. Later engagement becomes integrative. You start seeing relationships between ideas. You begin predicting outcomes. You refine assumptions. Eventually, engagement becomes generative. New insights emerge that were not obvious at the beginning. This progression only happens when attention remains in place long enough to move through all three stages. If attention is repeatedly interrupted, it rarely reaches the generative stage. It stays at the surface of understanding. This is one of the most important hidden costs of distraction. It does not just slow progress. It limits depth. And without depth, even productive effort can remain shallow. There is also a quiet emotional pattern that often accompanies sustained work. At the beginning of a focused session, there is usually clarity of intention. You know what you are doing. You know why you are doing it. But as time passes, that clarity can become less emotionally vivid. The initial sense of direction fades slightly. This is normal. It does not mean the work is wrong. It means attention is transitioning from motivation-driven engagement to structure-driven engagement. Motivation is loud at the beginning. Structure is quiet throughout. Many people mistake the fading of motivation as a signal to stop, but in many cases, it is simply the point where meaningful work begins to rely on consistency instead of excitement. If you continue through that phase, something stabilizes. You are no longer depending on emotional reinforcement to proceed. You are relying on an internal decision already made. This shift is subtle, but it is essential for sustained focus, because emotional states fluctuate. Structure remains. Another important element is learning to separate urgency from importance. Urgency is loud. It demands immediate attention. Importance is often quiet. It requires interpretation. If attention is constantly drawn to urgency, important work is repeatedly delayed, not because it is unrecognized, but because it is less emotionally forceful in the moment. Over time, this creates a pattern where days feel full, but meaningful progress feels limited. The solution is not to ignore urgency entirely. Some urgent matters are necessary, but without intentional boundaries, urgency expands to fill available attention. And when everything feels urgent, nothing receives sustained focus. A more stable approach is to define periods where importance is protected from interruption. During those periods, attention is not constantly reallocated based on external signals. It remains anchored to a chosen direction. This anchoring is what allows complex work to develop properly. Without it, attention remains reactive. With it, attention becomes constructive. Constructive attention does not simply respond to inputs. It builds something over time. And building requires continuity more than intensity. Even small improvements in continuity can produce noticeable differences in output over weeks and months, not because effort increases dramatically, but because cognitive fragmentation decreases. Less switching means less mental overhead. Less overhead means more available energy for thinking. More thinking capacity means better decisions within the same amount of time. This is how focus quietly transforms results without requiring extreme effort. Not through pressure, but through reduction of unnecessary internal movement. As this begins to stabilize, you may notice something subtle. Tasks that once felt scattered begin to feel more contained. Problems that once felt overwhelming begin to feel more structured. Work that once felt fragmented begins to feel more coherent. This is not because the work changed. It is because your attention did. And when attention becomes more stable, everything it touches becomes easier to understand. At a certain point in developing focus, you begin to notice that the real battle is not against distraction itself, but against the habit of abandoning direction too quickly. Most people do not lose focus because they are incapable of sustained thought. They lose focus because they repeatedly reset their attention before depth has a chance to form. Every reset seems small in isolation. A quick switch, a brief interruption, a short change in direction. But attention does not treat resets as neutral events. Each one restarts the internal process of orientation. And orientation is not effortless. It requires re-entering context, reconstructing understanding, and regaining momentum. This repeated re-entry is where much of mental fatigue originates, not from thinking too deeply, but from thinking shallowly in many directions without allowing any one direction to stabilize. When continuity becomes stronger, something important begins to change in your experience of effort. Tasks that once felt mentally fragmented begin to feel more unified. Instead of managing multiple scattered threads, you begin holding a single coherent line of thinking for longer periods. This reduces internal noise, not external noise necessarily, but the internal sense of fragmentation that comes from constant switching. As this stabilizes, your mind becomes less reactive to every passing impulse. You still notice distractions, but you are less compelled to follow them immediately. There is a growing gap between impulse and action, and within that gap, choice becomes possible. This is one of the most important developments in attention training. Not elimination of impulses, but the creation of space between impulse and response. That space is where intentional behavior lives. Without it, behavior is automatic. With it, behavior becomes directed. Over time, this changes not only how you work, but how you experience working. Instead of feeling pulled in multiple directions at once, you begin feeling anchored in a chosen direction. Anchoring does not remove difficulty, but it reduces internal fragmentation while difficulty is present. And that reduction is significant, because fragmented attention amplifies difficulty. Even simple tasks feel harder when attention is divided. Conversely, even complex tasks become more manageable when attention is unified. There is also a shift in how time is experienced during sustained focus. When attention is repeatedly interrupted, time often feels scattered. You look back and sense that the day was full, but not cohesive. Many small actions occurred, yet there is little sense of progression. When attention remains continuous, time begins to feel more linear. There is a sense of movement through a process, rather than jumping between unrelated points. This creates a psychological feeling of progress that is often missing in fragmented days. Not because more was done, but because what was done had continuity. That this sense of continuity reinforces motivation in a quieter way, not through excitement, but through clarity of direction. You can see where you started, you can see where you are, and you can sense the path forward more clearly. This reduces internal uncertainty, which in turn reduces the mind's tendency to seek distraction as relief. Because one of the main drivers of distraction is not just boredom, but uncertainty about direction. When direction is clear, attention is less likely to scatter. Another subtle benefit of sustained focus is the development of cognitive patience. Cognitive patience is the ability to remain with incomplete understanding without rushing toward premature conclusions or easy exits. Many meaningful problems do not resolve quickly. They require time for patterns to emerge. If attention exits too early, understanding remains partial. But if attention remains, the mind continues refining its internal model until clarity becomes more complete. This does not happen through force. It happens through continued presence. There is also a practical shift that occurs in how you approach future tasks. Instead of reacting to every new demand with equal urgency, you begin evaluating what actually requires sustained attention and what can be handled more efficiently. This creates natural prioritization, not forced discipline, but clearer judgment. And clearer judgment reduces unnecessary cognitive load before work even begins. As a result, starting becomes easier. Not because tasks became simpler, but because internal resistance decreased. Over time, this leads to a quieter form of confidence. Not confidence based on constant success, but confidence based on familiarity with returning to focus after distraction. You begin trusting your ability to re-engage, and that trust reduces anxiety around starting difficult work, because even if attention drifts, you know you can bring it back. This removes a layer of pressure that often makes focus feel fragile. It becomes more resilient, not perfect, but stable enough to sustain meaningful effort. And as this stability grows, something subtle but important happens. Focus stops feeling like something you must constantly defend and begins feeling like something you can reliably return to. That shift changes everything, because the goal was never to eliminate distraction entirely. The goal was to reduce its authority over your direction, and when that authority weakens, attention becomes available again for what actually matters. Not sporadically, but consistently enough to build something meaningful over time. At a certain stage of attention development, the challenge is no longer external distraction in its obvious forms. It is something quieter, more internal, more persistent. It is the habit of mentally leaving before physically leaving. The body remains at the task, but the mind has already started shifting elsewhere, thinking about what comes next, replaying something unrelated, anticipating interruption, rehearsing alternative actions. From the outside, it still looks like work is happening. But internally, attention has already fragmented. This is one of the most underestimated forms of lost focus, because it does not always appear as a clear break. It appears as partial presence, and partial presence produces partial outcomes. Over time, this state becomes normalized. People begin to believe they are working for long hours, yet the depth of that work remains shallow, not due to lack of effort, but due to repeated internal exits that go unnoticed. Rebuilding focus at this level requires a different kind of awareness. Not just noticing external distractions, but noticing when attention begins to detach internally. The moment your mind stops fully engaging with what is in front of you. The moment you begin simulating other scenarios instead of continuing the current one. That recognition alone is powerful because it reintroduces choice at a point where behavior would otherwise run automatically. You cannot correct what you do not observe, and many attention losses happen beneath the threshold of awareness. There is another layer to this process that is often overlooked: the relationship between mental clarity and task boundaries. When a task is not clearly defined, the mind struggles to stay anchored to it. It keeps searching for resolution points. It keeps asking, what exactly am I doing here? Without clarity, attention naturally drifts toward more defined activities, even if they are less important. This is why unclear work often feels heavier than complex work. Complexity is not the issue. Unstructured direction is. A clearly defined task acts like an anchor for attention. It reduces unnecessary internal negotiation about what to do next. The mind can remain engaged instead of constantly re-evaluating direction. But when tasks are vague, attention begins compensating by switching frequently, searching for clarity through movement rather than understanding. This creates the illusion of productivity, but it is often just navigation without destination. Another important aspect of sustained focus is emotional resistance to starting. Not fear in an extreme sense, but subtle resistance to engagement. A slight delay, a small hesitation, a tendency to postpone the initial entry into the task. This moment is critical because it often determines whether focus stabilizes or dissolves before it even begins. Starting is not just an action, it is a transition. From scattered attention into directed attention, from external awareness into internal structure. Once this transition is completed, maintaining focus becomes significantly easier. But many people repeatedly delay this transition, not because they are incapable, but because the mind prefers states that require less immediate structure. This is why beginning often feels disproportionately difficult compared to continuing. Once inside the work, resistance decreases. But the entry point carries weight. Understanding this allows a more practical approach. Instead of negotiating with the entire task, attention is guided towards simply entering it, reducing the psychological distance between intention and action. Even a small entry changes the state: opening the document, writing the first sentence, solving the first step, engaging with the first idea. These actions reduce resistance more effectively than extended planning alone. Because action reorganizes attention more quickly than thought, there is also a deeper structural principle behind sustained focus. Attention tends to follow the path of least resistance between clarity points. If the next step is unclear, attention wanders. If the next step is obvious, attention continues. This means that improving focus is not only about willpower, it is also about reducing ambiguity in the immediate next action. Clarity in the next step often matters more than clarity in the entire plan. A fully defined future is less important than a clearly defined present step. This is where many people unknowingly create friction. They try to solve the entire structure of a task before engaging with any part of it. But attention does not require full certainty. It requires a clear enough next move to stay engaged. As long as the next step is visible, focus can continue. When it is not, attention seeks alternatives. This principle applies across nearly all meaningful work: writing, problem solving, learning, decision-making, creative development. Any process that requires sustained engagement benefits from reducing ambiguity at the immediate level, not through rigid planning, but through ongoing clarification as you move forward. Focus is not a static state. It is a continuously maintained direction, and direction is preserved through repeated small clarifications rather than one large plan. As this understanding deepens, the experience of work begins to shift. Instead of feeling like you are constantly battling distraction, you begin noticing that attention responds more naturally when structure is clear, less friction, less hesitation, more continuity. And over time, that continuity becomes the foundation on which deeper concentration is built, not through intensity, but through clarity, maintained in motion. At a deeper level, focus is less about what you do and more about what you allow your attention to stop negotiating with. A large portion of mental fragmentation comes from constant internal bargaining. Should I continue? Is this the right approach? Am I doing this efficiently enough? Would something else be better? What if I am missing something? These questions are not inherently harmful. Reflection has value, adjustment has value, awareness of direction has value. But when they appear repeatedly during execution, they interrupt continuity. The mind stops building and starts re-evaluating. And building requires a different mode than evaluating. Evaluation is comparative. Building is sequential. Evaluation looks outward for alternatives. Building stays within one unfolding structure. When these modes constantly overlap, attention becomes unstable. This is why many people feel mentally exhausted even when they have not produced deep work. Their attention is repeatedly switching between doing and judging the doing. One of the most powerful shifts in sustained focus is learning to separate these modes in time. There is a phase for thinking about the task, and a phase for executing the task. When they blend continuously, attention fragments. When they are separated, attention stabilizes. This does not mean eliminating reflection. It means reducing unnecessary reflection during execution. During focused work, the priority becomes continuation. During review, the priority becomes adjustment. This simple separation reduces cognitive load significantly. Another subtle factor that influences focus is the perceived cost of switching tasks. If switching feels effortless, attention will switch more often. If switching has a small but noticeable cost, attention begins to stay longer. This cost does not need to be external or artificial. It can simply be the awareness that each switch requires mental reset. Each reset consumes energy. Each energy loss reduces depth. As this becomes clearer, attention naturally begins to resist unnecessary switching without force. Not because switching is forbidden, but because continuity becomes more valuable than novelty. There is also a psychological pattern that emerges when focus deepens over time. The mind starts recognizing the difference between stimulation and satisfaction. Stimulation is immediate. It is reactive. It often comes from external changes. Satisfaction is slower. It comes from completion, understanding, and progress. When attention is constantly exposed to stimulation, satisfaction becomes less noticeable. But when stimulation is reduced, satisfaction becomes more accessible. This is why periods of reduced distraction often feel uncomfortable at first, but more fulfilling later. The mind is recalibrating its reward system, not by removing pleasure, but by changing what it recognizes as meaningful reward. Another important aspect of sustained focus is the management of unfinished mental loops. Unfinished loops are thoughts or tasks that remain partially active in the background. Things you intended to do, the questions you did not resolve, ideas you started but did not complete. These incomplete elements quietly occupy attention even when you are not actively thinking about them. They increase internal noise. and internal noise reduces clarity. One of the reasons focus improves when tasks are completed is not only external productivity, it is internal closure. Completion reduces background cognitive load. This frees attention for deeper engagement with fewer competing threads. When too many loops remain open, attention is constantly divided, even during seemingly focused work. Closing loops does not mean finishing everything immediately. It means reducing unnecessary partial commitments. Either complete something or clearly park it so it is no longer actively demanding mental energy. This creates a cleaner cognitive environment, and a cleaner environment supports deeper attention. There is also a more subtle dimension to focus that develops with practice. The ability to stay with a single thought without immediately escaping into the next one. This is often overlooked because modern thinking tends to move quickly between associations. One idea leads to another, then another, then another. This associative movement can be creative, but it can also prevent depth when not guided. Sustained focus involves occasionally holding a single thread longer than feels necessary at first, allowing it to unfold fully before moving on. This often reveals insights that rapid switching would miss, because some understanding only appears after sustained contact with a single line of thinking. Not all insights are immediate. Some are cumulative. They form gradually as attention remains in one space long enough for patterns to stabilize. This is where depth begins to separate from surface-level engagement. Surface-level engagement touches many ideas. Depth stays with fewer ideas long enough to understand them properly. Neither is inherently superior in all contexts, but meaningful work often depends on knowing when to stay, and that decision is shaped by attention discipline, not force, not restriction, but the ability to recognize when continuation is more valuable than switching. As this ability strengthens, attention becomes less reactive to novelty and more responsive to purpose. And that shift marks a transition from scattered engagement to intentional focus. A transition that quietly changes not only what you do, but how fully you are able to inhabit what you are doing. At the most refined level of focus, the challenge is no longer about resisting obvious distractions. It becomes about sustaining coherence in thought long enough for meaning to fully surface. Coherence is different from effort. Effort is how much energy you apply. Coherence is how consistently that energy remains directed. A scattered effort can still be intense, but it produces limited depth because it is repeatedly redirected. A coherent effort may feel less dramatic, but it builds steadily because it remains structurally aligned over time. This is why some work feels mentally exhausting without feeling productive. Energy is present, but direction is unstable. The mind is active, but not unified. When coherence increases, something subtle changes in experience. Thoughts begin to feel less like isolated events and more like connected steps in a single unfolding process. Instead of repeatedly restarting your thinking, you continue extending it. Each idea builds on the previous one rather than replacing it. This reduces cognitive friction significantly, because one of the hidden costs of distraction is not just time lost, but continuity lost. Continuity is what allows understanding to deepen beyond surface interpretation. Without continuity, thinking remains fragmented into separate episodes. With continuity, thinking becomes cumulative, and cumulative thinking is where real depth emerges. There is also an important shift in how decisions are made during sustained focus. At earlier stages, attention often evaluates every possible direction. It compares alternatives. It reconsiders choices. It looks for optimal paths. But as focus stabilizes, decision-making becomes more linear. The next step becomes more obvious, because it is derived from what has already been established. Instead of constant re-evaluation, there is progression. This reduces mental strain significantly because the mind is no longer repeatedly reopening decisions that have already been made. A large amount of fatigue in modern work comes from unnecessary reopening of decisions, not from complexity itself, but from lack of commitment to a chosen direction during execution. Once a direction is chosen, Returning to it repeatedly strengthens coherence. Each return reduces ambiguity. Each continuation reduces internal noise. Over time, this creates a stable working rhythm where attention is not constantly negotiating its own path. Another important aspect of this stage is the relationship between attention and patience. Patience is often misunderstood as passive waiting. In the context of focus, patience is active continuity. It is the ability to remain engaged while results are still forming, not rushing toward resolution, not abandoning structure prematurely, but staying present long enough for development to complete its cycle. Many meaningful outcomes require time before they reveal their structure fully. Ideas need time to mature. Skills need repetition to stabilize. Understanding needs sustained exposure to deepen. If attention is constantly withdrawn before this maturation occurs, progress remains incomplete, not because effort was absent, but because duration was insufficient. Duration is often the missing variable in shallow results. Another subtle transformation that occurs with sustained focus is reduced emotional volatility during work. At earlier stages, fluctuations in motivation strongly influence attention. When motivation is high, engagement feels natural. When it drops, attention becomes unstable. As focus strengthens, behavior becomes less dependent on emotional state. Work continues, even when motivation is not elevated. Not through suppression of emotion, but through reduced dependency on it. This creates a more stable working identity, one that is not constantly shifting based on momentary internal conditions. Over time, this stability becomes self-reinforcing, because consistent engagement produces evidence that progress is not dependent on perfect emotional alignment. It depends on return and continuation. This is where focus becomes less about management and more about identity alignment. You are no longer someone trying to focus. You become someone who returns to focus. That difference is subtle but important. One implies effort against resistance. The other implies a default pattern of behavior. And default patterns shape long-term outcomes far more than occasional effort. As this identity stabilizes, attention becomes less scattered, not because distractions disappear, but because they lose structural authority. They no longer automatically redirect your trajectory. They become background signals rather than commands, and that shift fundamentally changes how work is experienced. Instead of being constantly pulled outward, attention begins settling inward, toward continuity, toward sustained engagement, toward deeper understanding, and toward a quieter, more stable form of productivity that does not rely on intensity, but on coherence maintained over time. This is the essence of advanced focus, not elimination, not perfection, but sustained direction that becomes easier to maintain than to abandon. At this stage of attention development, something subtle begins to happen. The external world has not changed in any fundamental way. Distractions still exist, information still flows, demands still appear without warning. But your relationship with all of it starts to shift. Previously, attention felt like something constantly being pulled. Now, it begins to feel more like something that can hold its position without being easily displaced. This does not mean distraction disappears. It means its influence weakens. There is an important distinction between the presence of distraction and the authority of distraction. Most people try to eliminate the first. Sustained focus is more concerned with reducing the second, because life will always contain competing inputs. The goal is not silence. The goal is stability. Stability means your attention can remain anchored, even when external conditions are not perfectly controlled. It means you are less dependent on ideal environments to think clearly or work effectively. This is where focus becomes less about reaction and more about structure. Structure is what holds attention in place when motivation fluctuates, when energy rises and falls, when external signals increase in volume. Without structure, attention follows whatever is most immediate. With structure, attention follows what has been intentionally chosen. One of the most important elements of structure is the ability to define clear starting points and clear continuation points. A starting point reduces hesitation. A continuation point reduces fragmentation. Together, they create a rhythm of engagement that minimizes unnecessary decision-making during work. Many people underestimate how much cognitive energy is lost, not during thinking, but during transition. The transition into work, the transition between tasks, the transition after interruption. Each transition requires the mind to reassemble focus, and repeated reassembly creates fatigue. This is why long, uninterrupted periods often feel more sustainable than frequent short bursts, even if the total time is similar. The mind prefers continuity over constant restarting. Another important shift at this level is the way uncertainty is experienced. Earlier, uncertainty often triggered avoidance. When something was unclear, attention would naturally drift toward more defined or easier alternatives. But with sustained focus practice, uncertainty begins to feel less like a threat and more like a normal stage of engagement. Complex tasks are rarely clear at the beginning. They become clear through continued interaction. When this is understood, uncertainty no longer automatically disrupts attention. Instead, it becomes something that is worked through rather than escaped from. This is not about comfort. It is about familiarity. What once felt unstable becomes recognizable, and what is recognizable becomes easier to remain with. There is also a quiet shift in how time is perceived during focused work. When attention is fragmented, time feels scattered. The day feels full, but disjointed. Many actions occur, but they do not form a coherent sequence in memory. When attention is continuous, time becomes more structured. You can trace a clear path of engagement. You can see progression. You can recognize development. This sense of continuity changes how effort is evaluated internally. Instead of measuring productivity by activity, you begin measuring it by progression. Not how much was done, but how far thinking moved within a single direction. This reduces the illusion of productivity that often comes from constant switching, because switching creates the appearance of motion, even when depth remains shallow. Another important element is the reduction of internal negotiation during work. At earlier stages, attention constantly evaluates whether to continue, pause, switch, or adjust direction. At this stage, those negotiations become less frequent, not because they are forcibly suppressed, but because the system becomes more stable. Fewer internal arguments, fewer competing impulses, more continuity in execution. This stability is what allows deeper cognitive processes to unfold without interruption. It creates space for sustained reasoning, longer chains of thought, and more integrated understanding. There is also a change in how effort is experienced. Instead of feeling like repeated bursts of energy, work begins to feel more like sustained flow with occasional adjustments. The energy is still present, but it is less fragmented, less wasted on restarting, more available for actual thinking. This shift often goes unnoticed at first because it is gradual, but over time, it becomes one of the most noticeable differences between scattered work and focused work. Not increased intensity, but reduced internal disruption. As this reduction continues, attention becomes more reliable under varied conditions, not dependent on perfect motivation, not dependent on ideal environments, not dependent on emotional alignment, but capable of returning to structure even when conditions are imperfect. This reliability is what makes focus sustainable, because life is rarely perfectly aligned, and systems that depend on perfect alignment tend to collapse under normal conditions. Stable attention, however, adapts. It adjusts, it returns, and it continues. That is where real progress becomes possible over the long term. At this stage, the most important shift is no longer about improving how you concentrate in ideal conditions. It is about how quickly you can re-establish focus after it has been broken. Because breaks will happen, not as exceptions, but as part of normal cognitive life. Attention is not a sealed system. It is constantly interacting with input, interruption, and internal fluctuation. Even in highly structured environments, drift occurs. The difference between average attention and trained attention is not the absence of drift. It is the speed and stability of return. Return is where the real skill lives. Not in perfect continuity, but in recovery without collapse. When attention drifts, and there is no structured return, fragmentation accumulates. Each drift becomes a small reset. Each reset reduces depth over time. Work becomes a sequence of disconnected starts rather than a continuous progression. But when return becomes automatic, something important changes. Disruption loses its long-term cost. A momentary interruption no longer defines the trajectory of the entire session. It becomes a brief deviation that is corrected without emotional weight. This reduces internal friction significantly, because much of the exhaustion people associate with focus is not caused by thinking itself. It is caused by repeated loss and reconstruction of attention without a stable recovery pattern. When recovery becomes efficient, attention becomes resilient. There is also a structural element to this resilience that is often overlooked. It depends on reducing the number of open cognitive loops during work. An open loop is any unresolved mental thread that continues to demand background attention. A task left half-defined, a decision not yet finalized, an idea partially explored, a reminder not yet integrated into action. Each of these creates subtle background activity. Even when you are focused, part of your attention is allocated to maintaining these unresolved elements. This reduces available depth. Closing loops does not require completing everything immediately. It requires either completing or clearly parking them so they no longer actively compete for attention. When cognitive space becomes cleaner, focus does not need to fight against internal noise as frequently. This is one of the less visible but highly influential aspects of sustained attention. Another important dimension is the reduction of task switch latency. Task switch latency is the delay between deciding to switch and actually switching. When latency is low, switching happens frequently and almost automatically. When latency increases slightly, switching becomes more deliberate. Even a small increase in this internal delay can significantly reduce fragmentation over time. Not by preventing change, but by making change less reflexive. This creates space for reconsideration, not emotional hesitation, but structural awareness. Is this switch necessary? Is this continuation still aligned with the goal? Or is this impulse simply seeking novelty? This pause is often enough to preserve continuity without requiring strict rules. As focus strengthens further, something more subtle begins to emerge. The mind starts recognizing patterns of interruption before they fully occur. You notice the early signals of drift, slight restlessness, a tendency to check something, a subtle shift away from engagement. At this point, correction becomes easier because it happens earlier in the process, not after full distraction, but at the initial stage of deviation. Early correction is significantly less costly than late correction, because it preserves momentum before it fully dissolves. Over time, this creates a smoother experience of work, less disruption, fewer full resets, more continuous engagement with the task at hand. Another shift that becomes noticeable is the reduction of internal urgency. At earlier stages, the mind often treats every interruption or thought as requiring immediate response. This creates a constant sense of urgency that fragments attention. As focus matures, urgency becomes more filtered. Not everything requires immediate action. Not every thought requires immediate resolution. Not every input requires immediate response. This filtering reduces cognitive pressure, and reduced pressure allows for more stable attention. There is also a deeper change in how progress is perceived. Instead of evaluating progress moment by moment, attention begins to evaluate it across longer spans. Not by how active the mind felt during a session, but by what was actually developed within that session. This shift reduces the illusion of productivity that comes from constant movement without depth, and it increases appreciation for slower, more stable progress, even when it feels less stimulating in the moment. This is where focus becomes more self-sustaining, because the reward is no longer tied to constant stimulation. It is tied to continuity and completion. And as this internal reward structure stabilizes, attention naturally begins to favor depth over fragmentation, not because distraction disappears, but because depth becomes more satisfying than interruption. That preference is what ultimately sustains long-term focus without requiring constant effort. It becomes less about resisting distraction and more about preferring continuity, and that preference, once established, quietly reshapes how attention is used in almost every area of life. At this final stage of understanding focus, the most important realization is not that distraction disappears, but that its influence is no longer decisive. Distraction still exists in many forms. Thoughts arise unexpectedly. External signals continue to compete for attention. Internal fluctuations in energy still occur. None of this is eliminated. What changes is the structure of response. Earlier in the process, attention tended to follow distraction quickly and automatically. A stimulus appeared, and attention moved. A thought emerged, and attention shifted. An interruption occurred, and attention fragmented. Now, there is a gap. A small but meaningful space between stimulus and response. In that space, direction becomes possible. This is where attention training ultimately leads, not to perfect control, but to increased responsiveness to intention rather than impulse. That distinction is critical. Impulse is immediate and reactive. Intention is chosen and maintained. When attention is governed primarily by impulse, work becomes reactive. It adapts continuously to external and internal fluctuations without a stable center. When attention is guided by intention, work becomes directional. It maintains continuity even when fluctuations occur. This does not eliminate change. It organizes it. One of the clearest signs that attention has become more stable is the reduction of unnecessary reinterpretation during work. At earlier stages, the mind constantly reevaluates what is being done. Is this still the right approach? Should I adjust direction? Is there a better option? While reflection is useful, excessive reevaluation during execution interrupts continuity. As focus strengthens, reevaluation becomes more contained. It shifts to specific moments rather than continuous background activity. This allows execution to proceed without constant internal interruption. Another important transformation is the change in how interruptions are integrated. Instead of causing complete fragmentation, interruptions become temporary deviations that are absorbed and corrected. Attention does not fully dissolve. It bends slightly, then returns. This elasticity is a key feature of stable focus, not rigidity, but recoverable continuity, the ability to be interrupted without losing the entire structure of engagement. This significantly reduces the long-term cost of distractions, because what matters is not whether interruption happens, but whether it permanently disrupts direction. In trained attention, it does not. There is also a deeper shift in the emotional tone of work itself. At earlier stages, work often alternates between resistance and relief. Resistance when starting, relief when stopping. As focus stabilizes, this emotional oscillation reduces. Work becomes less defined by tension between engagement and escape. Instead, it becomes more continuous in tone. Not always easy, not always comfortable, but less fragmented emotionally. This creates a more sustainable internal environment for long-term effort. Another subtle but important development is the reduction of cognitive re-entry cost after breaks. Breaks remain necessary. They are part of sustainable attention. But after a break, the return to work becomes faster and more stable. Less reorientation is required. Less mental reconstruction is needed. The structure of the task remains more intact in memory. This is a direct result of sustained continuity earlier in the process, because when attention has remained stable for longer periods, it builds stronger internal representation of the work itself. That representation persists even when attention briefly leaves. This is what makes return easier, and easier return reinforces continuity further. A reinforcing cycle begins to form. Continuity improves return. Return strengthens continuity. Over time, this cycle stabilizes attention into a more reliable pattern of engagement. At this point, focus is no longer experienced as a constant struggle. It becomes a default mode that is occasionally interrupted, rather than a fragile state that must be constantly maintained. This shift is subtle but profound, because it changes the emotional relationship with work. Instead of approaching tasks with anticipation of constant internal resistance, there is a growing expectation of stability with manageable interruptions. This reduces anticipatory stress, and reduced stress further supports sustained attention. There is also a final and important realization that emerges from this entire process. Focus is not a single ability that you either have or do not have. It is a layered system composed of awareness, structure, continuity, return, and reduction of unnecessary internal fragmentation. Each layer reinforces the others, and each layer can be strengthened through repetition over time. No single moment creates focus, but many small decisions accumulate into it. Each time you return instead of switching, each time you continue instead of abandoning, each time you clarify instead of fragmenting. Each of these moments contributes to a more stable attention system, and over time, that system begins to shape not just how you work, but how you experience your work. More continuity, less fragmentation, more direction, less drift, more presence, less automatic reaction, and ultimately, a quieter form of clarity that does not depend on ideal conditions, but on the ability to remain aligned with intention, even in imperfect ones. That is the foundation on which sustained focus is built. Not elimination of distraction, but the steady strengthening of return, structure, and continuity until attention naturally prefers depth over dispersion. There is a point in every long internal struggle with attention where the problem stops feeling like a lack of knowledge and starts revealing itself as a pattern of direction. Not ignorance, not incapacity, but repetition. Attention becomes what it is repeatedly allowed to become. If it is frequently redirected, it learns to move quickly, lightly, and without depth. If it is repeatedly returned, it learns something very different. It learns stability. It learns continuity. It learns how to stay long enough for something to fully form. This is why focus is not a single breakthrough moment. It is not a sudden transformation that permanently removes distraction from your life. That expectation creates unnecessary pressure and often leads to frustration. Focus is quieter than that. It is built in ordinary moments that most people overlook. The moment you continue instead of switching. The moment you return instead of drifting further. The moment you stay with something slightly longer than your impulse suggests. Each of these moments is small on its own, almost insignificant in isolation. But attention does not change through isolated events. It changes through accumulation. And accumulation always takes time. As focus strengthens, something subtle begins to shift in how effort feels. Tasks still require energy, challenges still appear, uncertainty still exists, but the internal experience of fragmentation begins to reduce. You are no longer constantly rebuilding your attention from scattered pieces. There is more continuity from one moment to the next, more coherence across time. This creates a different kind of mental environment. Not one free of difficulty, but one where difficulty is not constantly multiplied by internal disruption. In that environment, thinking becomes more stable, decisions become more deliberate, work becomes more connected, and progress becomes easier to recognize, not because it suddenly accelerates, but because it becomes less interrupted. There is also a quieter change in how you relate to yourself during this process. Earlier, attention lapses may have felt like failure points, moments of frustration, evidence of inconsistency. But as understanding deepens, those moments begin to lose that meaning. They become recognized for what they are, Temporary deviations within a system that is learning how to stabilize. The important part is not whether attention ever drifts. The important part is what happens after it drifts. Do you remain lost in the distraction, or do you return? That single response becomes more defining than the initial interruption. Return is where focus is rebuilt. Return is where continuity is restored. Return is where identity gradually shifts from someone who is easily scattered to someone who reliably comes back. Over time, that pattern shapes not just productivity, but trust in your own ability to engage deeply with what matters. And that trust becomes one of the most valuable internal foundations you can develop. Because when you trust your ability to return, distraction loses much of its long-term power. It may still appear, it may still interrupt, but it no longer defines the outcome of your attention. You are no longer at its mercy. You are simply in a process of continuous adjustment, steady return, and increasingly stable direction. And in that process, something important becomes clear. Focus was never about perfection. It was about direction maintained over time. Not flawless attention, but reliable attention. Not constant intensity, but consistent return. And when that understanding settles fully, attention stops being something you struggle to control moment by moment, and starts becoming something you shape gradually through the way you choose to respond, again and again, across ordinary days. That is where real focus lives, not in control, but in continuity. Not in elimination, but in return, and not in force, but in steady alignment with what matters most.